This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Mel Brooks as King Louis XVI in the 1981 comedy History of the World, Part 1.
Everything's so green.
Majesty, may I have a word with you?
Ooh, care for a little tooth?
No, merci.
Don't indulge, huh? Well, leaves more for us. Who are you?
Your Majesty, I am Mademoiselle Rambo.
Nice names. Tell me, my dear, what can I do for you?
Your Majesty, my father, Monsieur Rambo, for 10 years has languished in the Bastille. If I don't get him out soon, he will surely die. I throw myself on your mercy. Please release him.
Why was he put into the Bastille?
He said something at a royal dinner party and someone overheard him.
What did he say?
He said, the poor ain't so bad.
Oy, say, the poor ain't so bad. You're lucky he's still alive.
Please, Your Majesty, don't let him die. I'll do anything to gain his pardon. Anything.
Anything?
Your Majesty, I was raised in a convent. I don't indulge in pleasures of the flesh.
You don't put out, he don't get out.
But Your Majesty, I simply don't do it.
Come on, you do it. You know you do it. We all do it. We love to do it. You do it.
No, I don't.
You want to do it. I do it. I love to do it. I just did it and I'm ready to do it again. Don't tell me you don't do it. Now, either you do it or your father dies. It's either hump or death.
Humperdinck?
Not hump-a-dink. Hump or death. You got 10 seconds to make up your mind. Hump, death, hump, death, hump, death, hump, death, hump, death, hump, death. Your time is running out. Hump, death, hump, death.
Right, hump!
Very good. I'm glad you thought it over. Be at my chambers at midnight. A tutelar. Wait. Don't wear anything complicated. It's good to be the king.
What would you do if you had absolute power? And by absolute, I don't mean that you're the president or that you're someone like Bill Gates or Elon Musk and you just happen to be immensely wealthy, or that you're some sort of popular celebrity, an athlete, a rock star, someone like that. I mean, if you had all those things together, if you had so much power that you didn't even really have to worry about popular opinion or social or cultural norms or morals, that you had so much power you could literally do anything that your heart's desired and no one would be there to stop you or criticize you or perhaps even think less of you. What would you do? Would you be a great leader, doing God's work and ensuring the happiness and moral fulfillment of people here on earth? Would you be a not-so-caped crusader, bringing justice and law and order to the rougher parts of the world? Would you be a great philanthropist and solve the great crises of hunger or plague, or make it possible for poor people to start businesses or attend schools? Would you be more selfish than that? Would you be a great conqueror, some sort of mythical Alexander, a Charlemagne, a Napoleon, a Hitler, someone who wins glory in historical eternity through great feats of arms or cunning or strategy? Or would you give in to the pleasures of the flesh, to pursue your own pleasure at the expense of everyone else? In the clip I just played for you, we meet a version of King Louis XVI of France, played by the comedian Mel Brooks. This Louis confronts a young, attractive woman whose father languishes in prison and offers to release him if she will only sleep with him. Now, this is not what we would typically think of as carrying out justice. And remember, this is what medieval and early modern kings, the whole reason for them having all this power is that they're supposed to carry out justice. But Mel Brooks's Louis couldn't think about that for more than a second, right? He doesn't care if the father has really done something or not done something. He has only one thing on his mind, and that's basically getting into this woman's pants. To further add to this character, Mel Brooks's Louis is not satisfied by the prospect of just one sexual encounter. In the scene before the part that I played for you, he's actually playing chess, and it's kind of like a real-life three-dimensional chess, so he's got his servants that are acting out as the pieces. And at one point, he starts losing, and he's kind of petulant and childish, and he gets upset, and so he invokes what he calls the king's privilege. And the privilege is to be able to take 3 moves in a row. All of these moves turn out to be, quote, jump the queen. And so as soon as he says this, the knight jumps the queen, it doesn't mean the knight jumps over the queen, it means the knight jumps on the queen and starts humping her. So he does this with all 3 of his pieces, and then he grabs a giant bullhorn and he says, gang bang! And all the chess pieces, all the pawns, everybody, they all jump on top of the queen, and it seems like a little orgy. Now, as if that's not enough, Louis, right before this scene again that I played for you, snorts a little coke, looks around, he remarks, everything is so green. He walks up to another random woman, kisses her between her breasts, looks at the camera and gives that little quib, it's good to be the king. And so after that then, he tries to seduce Mademoiselle Rambaud, and then he kisses another woman and does again that little, it's good to be the king, right? You get this idea. This Louis is completely selfish, completely egotistical, completely bound up with the idea of pursuing his own pleasure. He doesn't really care about the people of France. In fact, later on in a different scene, he's shown kind of skeet shooting, only instead of using the little clay pigeons, they actually toss peasants up in the air. And he shoots the peasants as he's saying, I love my people. I would never do anything to hurt my people. Pull. This self-absorbed, sexually focused, hedonistic Louis is obviously something of a comedic invention. Just like we saw with a lot of the Monty Python sketches, he's exaggerated to make the character more funny and more of an imbecile to modern audiences. But this is not a stereotype that would have been unfamiliar to Louis' subjects, who often circulated stories of a monarch who was lustful, dull, gluttonous, dim-witted, and interestingly enough, also a cuckold. There are many stories about Marie Antoinette and other members of the royal household, where you have like a minister with some pearls, and the minister kind of leads the woman into the bushes, almost like a dog, saying, here, come get the shiny object. And then presumably he goes behind and rapes her. So this isn't the portrayal we saw of Louis XIV, the great conqueror, the sun god, the center of everyone's universe, the sun, the light. This guy is an idiot. Now, for most of us, this idea that you would portray a political leader as an idiot, as someone who was overly focused on their own pleasure, it's not really surprising, right? We have our own political shows, things like Saturday Night Live, The Daily Show. If you listen to talk radio programs, right, they're constantly lampooning political figures, making fun of them, again, making them seem like idiots, making them seem like they're sort of, especially with like Bill Clinton, right, you get this idea that he's always kind of looking out for the next lady to seduce. So on the one hand, this seems kind of ordinary to us. But on the other, for this particular time period, this desacralization, if you will, of the monarchy was incredibly important. Absolutism, you recall, was meant to solve this crisis of order, this widespread outbreak of violence that begins around the mid-17th century. And so the answer was to develop a highly centralized state with a leader, the king, in some cases the queen, who had absolute power, who could break the barriers to projecting power created by the aristocracy, the nobles. And as we saw with Louis XIV, one of the keys to making this work is essentially to become a rock star, to develop the kind of cultural sense, the kind of aura, if you will, that when you walk in the room, people go, wow, that's Louis XIV. Wow, we really are in the shadow of greatness. When people walk in the steps of Louis XVI, they don't feel that same sense of awe or dread or mystery or sacredness. Louis XVI seems like a bum. And so as you think about the foundations of absolutism, why would anyone want to give someone like Louis XVI that kind of power? Now, of course, it's worth noting, this again is a fictionalization of the actual Louis XVI. He was not quite this lustful, not quite this kind of dim-witted, this disinterested in the idea of rulership. But popular perceptions matter. And as we're going to see today in our lecture, one of the great causal factors of the French Revolution is that this absolute monarchy that was built up over the course of about 150 years collapses or erodes from the inside. Years of mismanagement, years of lacking that appreciation for the cultural power of the monarchy, years of being made fun of, it all kind of chips away at the authority of the monarchy. And so what is going to end up happening that causes the French Revolution is you have this collapse of authority. Absolutism fails spectacularly. But this brings us to the real focus of our lecture today, because it's not so much the question of why does the French Revolution start, it's why doesn't the French Revolution end? Why doesn't it play out like the American Revolution, where, okay, the Americans, the colonists, they throw off King George III, they set up new institutions. Okay, the Articles of Confederation weren't so great, so it took a little while to be able to kind of work that out, get the Constitution. But there is not widespread violence in the streets of Boston or Washington or Charleston in the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution. Something in the French Revolution goes wrong, goes horribly wrong, leads to widespread bloodshed, thousands and thousands of people being guillotined without even really receiving what we would call a fair or proper trial. So why does this go so wrong? How do we get there? And how do we begin to put the pieces back together? That's going to be the subject of our talk today. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're talking about the French Revolution today. And before we get into the kind of story or the narrative of it, I just want to spend a little time thinking about what is the French Revolution? What do you think about it? Outside of maybe reading about it in high school history class or maybe even a college history class, when I say French Revolution, what comes to mind? Do you think about it at all? Is it just, okay, I know there was a French Revolution, there was American Revolution, Russian Revolution, English Revolution. Everybody's got a revolution. But how much time have you actually spent thinking about the French Revolution? The answer is you probably haven't spent a lot of time, right? It doesn't seem that important to you. But before World War I, if I'd have asked this question, most of you would have had a very strong opinion about the French Revolution. The French Revolution wasn't just another event. It was the event, the founding of the modern era. And there were two basic ways of telling that story, right? You're talking about the same history, in many cases the same characters, but very, very different takes on the meaning of the revolution. On the one hand, you have this kind of romantic version of the French Revolution, where it is the sort of beginning point of a larger narrative of emancipation, of liberty. The story of how we came to believe that the people and the nation are the sources of sovereignty. The beginning of the story when we start to say, you know what, everybody should be equal before the law. And maybe everybody wasn't equal before the law, and maybe we still have had to work that out 200 years later. But the idea first became realized. The idea first sort of took seed, it germinated at the moment of the French Revolution. Those corporate worlds that we had talked about, the first kind of moment when they began to fall apart is with these revolutionaries. The idea of liberty, equality, fraternity. That slogan is born in the midst of the French Revolution. And if you even want to include the American Revolution sort of in this story, it's kind of like a precursor. It happens a little bit beforehand. But it's a lot of the same ideas, right? If you think about the American Revolution, for many of you, when you think about the American Revolution, it's certainly a positive thing. Maybe you don't think about it as the moment when, okay, we figured it all out and we actually did have liberty. Clearly, there were some issues with slavery. Clearly, there were some issues with the treatment of Native Americans, with women. Democracy was not open yet for men who did not have property. But it's the beginning of that story. It's the first real moment when we start moving in that direction. And that's a powerful moment. That's an important moment. And that's something that should be celebrated, many people would argue. And so the French Revolution can be seen in these terms, right? It is the beginning, not just of a change in government or even a style of government, but it is a reworking of the very social fabric where the values that we tend to cherish today Again, the idea of liberty, the idea of equality, those values first begin to be celebrated publicly, first begin to triumph. The dream isn't realized in 1789, but we start being able to dream that dream, one might say. There's another kind of positive way of thinking about the revolution, and this is embraced mainly by the Bolsheviks and by communists, where you start to think about the French Revolution not as the moment when, okay, all those values that we wanted, first became kind of dominant, but as a blueprint for future social revolutions. So you have your group that kind of looks again at the French Revolution as being a positive story, right? You're going to get out your popcorn and you're going to sit down and maybe you have your little tricolor flag and you're going to wave it. And this is going to be today the beginning of a good story. This is not the only way of interpreting the French Revolution, however, because it also shows the darker side of modernity. And of course, we know this regardless of what generation you're from. There is a natural kind of tug and push between the idea of change and tradition. There is a fear. What happens if we go too far? A colleague gave me an old newspaper the other day from 1997, and it was showing the all the major events that happened in 1997. And one of the things they showed was cloning. There was a sheep named Dolly, and they cloned this sheep, and it raised these immense questions, right? So cloning, well, if you could clone organs, that would be nice. If I have something going wrong with my liver, but I can clone it and grow a new healthy liver that is my cells and my body, oh my God, you could cure cancer, at least early stage cancers. But then can you take it too far? If I could clone my brain cells, could I be immortal? Could I never die? Just keep growing new brains and transferring the information over? Could I create super soldiers? Could I start genetically engineering? What would happen to the population of Earth? Right? Many cultures, it's unfortunate, but the reality is that in many cultures, people want to have boys. So what if you could select the sex of your baby? Well, what if the population then tilted to being like 60% male, 40% female? Uh-oh. So the point I'm making here is that change, while it can be good, there is also kind of a fear, a sense that maybe we've gone too far, that there are consequences. We know this story well. A very popular version of this story that was written at the beginning of the 19th century is Frankenstein. Dr. Frankenstein manages to reanimate a corpse. What's going to happen then? So the French Revolution is in some ways not a positive story, but it is a horror story. It raises all sorts of questions about what happens when we abandon traditional politics. What happens if we lose control? Right? All of our political leaders, they all have policies they want to enact. They all have goals. Even a lot of the most radical people out there have some sort of end goal in mind. But what happens if you can no longer control the people that you rile up? What happens if we start to move beyond extra legal means for causing change in society and start to use violence? How do you put that genie back in the bottle? You have a wicked king, you overthrow the king. Okay. What comes next? How do you put the brakes on a revolution? There are also questions raised by the French Revolution about the relationship between individuals and mass society. What does democracy mean? Does it mean rule of the majority? Does it mean the rule of the mob? So the French Revolution is full of a lot of idealism. It's also full of a lot of violence. And in the end, one of the things that it becomes is one of the first social revolutions. The French Revolution is not just about, is Louis XVI a good king? And in some ways, it's not even about, should we have a king? It becomes an attempt to fundamentally change society, to change economics, to change culture, to displace the power of the Catholic Church, to not only embrace this idea that sovereignty comes from the people, but to try to figure out in a practical way, okay, what does that mean? How do we decide what the will of the people actually is? What does this mean in a practical sense? And so the history of the French Revolution is not just another revolution. It is the founding moment, many would argue, of modernity. The modern world that we live in today, with our modern values, with our expectations, with our sensibilities, much of it can be traced back to the French Revolution. We could also add many of our problems today can be traced back to the French Revolution. So this episode today, we're going to talk about the French Revolution. It's probably going to be a little bit longer than most of our episodes because there is so much going on and so much of it is so important. And what's really kind of ironic is that I'm giving you the short version today, right? We're probably going to go close to 2 hours. This is the short version, right? Hopefully one day I'll be able to give more of a blow-by-blow podcast on it. I know there are other podcasts out there about the French Revolution specifically. It really should be made into like a Game of Thrones like miniseries because there are so many twists and turns, intrigues. So if there's some young screenwriter out there and you're thinking, gosh, I really want to make my way, drop me a line, right? Contact me at our social media and I'll work with you on this. Okay, well, let's begin our story. The initial problems that lead up to the collapse of the French monarchy are financial. To make a long story short, as we saw with Louis XIV, he's spending a lot of money. Louis XV is spending a lot of money. Louis XVI is also not so circumspect about finances. Those of us living in the United States, by the way, are partly responsible for that. For over a century, France and Britain had kind of gone back and forth, fighting over colonies, fighting over control of the sea. Of course, the French famously lose what we in the United States call the French and Indian War. More globally, it's called the 7 Years' War. But basically, it witnesses the British kicking the French out of North America and out of a number of their other colonies. A couple decades later, the British are having problems with their North American colonists, in part because the British want the colonists to pay for the 7 Years' War. They're not giving the colonists all the benefits of winning that war. And so when these colonies prove at the Battle of Saratoga that they actually have a chance of beating the British, the French are only too happy to help out. And so France declares war on Britain. France begins to support the American revolutionaries. They critically send their navy. So when we're talking about the triumph of the colonies, the surrender of Cornwallis, part of that is because the French fleet has blocked off his escape. But all of this costs tremendous amounts of money. By 1788, the French owe over 4 billion livres, billion with a B. To put that into perspective, we're talking about a debt that consumes more than half of the French budget. Half of the money the French state is spending in 1789 is just going to pay creditors. Of course, as in most revolutionary stories, there's also some famine going on here. And so by the time you get to 1789, Louis XVI is starting to say, wait a minute, my state is non-functional. We are having huge problems. When these financial problems hit, you always have reformers. You say, okay, how can we change things, right? How can we improve our financial condition? And reformers like Jacques Necker say, well, one thing we could do is we could have those nobles start paying taxes. Maybe we can redo the system of taxation in France. Of course, nobody likes it when you redo the system of taxation. Nobody likes it when you raise taxes. So this creates kind of a standoff between the nobility and the monarchy, right? What are we going to do? Finally, the king says, okay, the only solution to this is what our forefathers used to do. Let us call the Estate Générale. Let us bring in the members not only of the nobility, but the clergy. Let us bring in the doctors and lawyers and wealthy merchants who are members of the kind of common class or the third estate. We're all going to get together and we'll debate payments to the crown, but also reforms. Right? We'll negotiate, we'll accept some things. And so there's a lot of fanfare associated with the opening of this Estate Générale on May 5th, 1789. But there's a slight problem. No Estate Générale had been called since 1614, about 160, 170 years. And so there are debates about what the rules are. Imagine if the American Congress did not meet for 160 years, and then they all got back together. I say, okay, what are the rules? Right? Are we doing the filibuster? Are we not doing the filibuster? It's not like an official rule, but it's more of like a tradition. Or maybe it's not a permanent rule would be a way to say it. And so they debate about the very nature of the rules. how do we decide what the will of the Estate General is? For members of the nobility and also many members of the clergy, they say, okay, we live in an early modern society. We live in a corporate society. Of course, we vote by estates. The first estate, the nobles, gets one vote. The second estate, the clergy get one vote. And all you commoners, the third estate, you guys get one vote as well. Now, because many of the clergy, especially the more powerful clergy, bishops, archbishops, that sort of thing, because they're drawn from noble families, they are going to tend to vote with the nobles, and the nobles will be able to push through whatever they want. Members of the third estate stand up and say, wait a minute, we're not a corporate society anymore. We believe in the Enlightenment. We believe in the individual. Everybody should get one vote. In fact, maybe we should expand the third estate because you guys, we represent a lot more people per person than the nobility do. One person, one vote. We'll also get some votes from the second estate, one or two votes from the first estate. If we do by individuals voting, then we're going to win. So they get bogged down in fights over how the Estate General should actually operate. A second problem, though, is that more sort of philosophically, members of the second estate are not there. The first and second estate are not there really because they care about the crown and they want to solve Louis's financial problems. They are really there because they say, look, this is our chance to air our grievances. For 170 years, we've had to put up with absolutism, with despotism, centralization. What happened to our historical rights? You're not respecting those anymore, Louis. And the previous Louis didn't either. Well, we are going to push back against that now. This is our moment to have our grievances addressed. We have leverage. So the nobles want their privileges confirmed, expanded, reinstituted, buttressed. Now, the members of the third estate have the opposite idea. We're getting together. We're having this great moment. We can talk about reforms. Wonderful. Let's get rid of privilege. Let's have equality before the law, equal taxation. So not only do you have the two sides that are kind of fighting with each other, neither of them is really representing the interests of the king. And so they go back and forth about this for about 6 weeks. Until on June 20th, 1789, some members of the clergy basically break ranks. They go over to the third estate. They say, you know what, we should be together. And they create something called the National Assembly. There's a tennis court at Versailles. They're meeting outside the Palace of Versailles. They go to this tennis court, and they all famously take an oath, not to Louis, not to the monarchy. They take an oath to the nation. And they call themselves the National Assembly. They say, we are the representatives of the people. We are going to write a constitution. We're going to create a written document that puts limits on this absolutist king. As you might imagine, Louis is not too happy about this, right? He's not, okay, I'm an absolute monarch. Oh, well, you're going to claim the powers I have. I'll just go. No, Louis XVI is furious. And so he orders 18,000 troops to Paris as a means of kind of banging some heads together and let's get these nobles and third estaters focused on what they should be doing, which is giving me money. Now, these soldiers, as I mentioned before, it's not like the National Guard. It's not like the army from whatever country that you're listening to this in, where you and those soldiers, have a sense of commonality, where even though there might be, somebody from Idaho and they're in the army and they're deployed in your region, if you're an American, you like that, even if you're not from Idaho. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, you don't have that sense of national fraternity yet. When the king calls 18,000 troops out, the people of Paris understand that not as, oh, good, here comes the forces of law and order. They understand that as, here come troops that are going to rape and pillage. Here come troops that are going to, at the very least, take some food from us in a time when many people are starving. We should add that many of these soldiers are not French. Many come from, are mercenaries that come from Germany, from other territories held by the king. And so the people of Paris, regardless of how much they cared about the politics of the Third Estate, the politics of the National Assembly, when they hear thousands of troops are coming to our town, they decide they need to resist that. They begin to arm themselves against these troops. Now, actually, these kind of militias, if you will, these citizen soldiers that are kind of coming together. They have some firearms, right? Firearms are not necessarily the problem, but what you really need are the more cannons, the better. But you really need gunpowder. You need the ability to be able to sustain resistance. So where are you going to get a bunch of gunpowder in downtown Paris in the middle of the summer in 1789? The answer is that there is a large fortress. At that time, it was sort of on the outskirts of Paris. Today, it's very much in the center of Paris. But it was a kind of like a castle that had been built in the 1300s called the Bastille. At this point, it's being used as a prison. There's not actually that many prisoners there, but there's gunpowder in it. And so this massive crowd gathers outside. Basically, they go back and forth with the governor who was in charge of this prison. At one point, he kind of negotiates with them, and they think that they've solved the issue. And then part of the crowd, kind of gets animated. There are rumors of a double cross, and the crowd ends up storming this fortress called the Bastille. They end up cutting that governor's head off, and they stick it on a pike, and they march around Paris. They get all the gunpowder out. They get some of the cannons. And in fact, they actually start taking apart the fortress that night. And so the king hears about this and says, maybe this is a little bit more complicated than I thought. Maybe I should back off. I don't want street-to-street fighting. I don't want a real revolution. And so the king recognizes the authority of the National Assembly. The French Revolution had begun. Now, so far, this doesn't sound so bad. Okay, yeah, we've got, the king being kind of knocked down a peg. We're going to have Constitution. This doesn't sound all that different than what happened in the United States. And in fact, had the revolution stopped at this initial stage, many of us today would look back and think about the revolution in much different terms than we do today. One of the first things that they do, having secured power, is they start building an enlightened-based society. On August 4th, 1789, just a couple weeks after the fall of the Bastille, the National Assembly officially abolishes feudalism in France. Lords were no longer able to require their peasants to make payments, to perform services. They could not deny them the right to leave. Very importantly, manorial courts were suppressed, and the idea is that they're eventually going to be outlawed, right? So no longer can some noble suddenly say, well, I just don't like people that are left-handed. If you're left-handed, you're not allowed to write with your left hand. Prior to 1789, they could do that, right? If that's what you wanted, if you were a lord. Another big thing, the sale of public office is banned. We talked about how monarchs were trying to figure out, okay, how do I make money? How do I get revenue? Well, one quick way to do that is you sell off public offices. You say, being the tax collector, that's actually fairly lucrative. There are people who would pay good money, not just to collect the taxes, but for the right to collect the taxes and to set the taxes. Can you imagine if we said, okay, the IRS is now for sale. If you want to be head of the IRS, just bid. Whoever bids the most, they win, and then they can set whatever taxes they want. This was a huge problem because the tax collectors then would not be focused on collecting the necessary taxes or collecting the taxes they're legally obligated to. They would try to make as much money as they could. The idea of selling public power, even though it obviously still happens, is one that we would reject the idea of it. Right? People shouldn't be able to buy public offices because the whole point of public office is to serve the people. Another big thing this decree in 1789 did, it gets rid of the noble exemptions for taxes. It opens up positions in things like the army to people of non-noble birth. And so if we're talking about realizing the Enlightenment, the first steps taken by the National Assembly in 1789 are moving in that direction. A couple of weeks later, on August 26, 1789, they issue what becomes known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And this is kind of like the U.S. Bill of Rights, right? It guarantees things like the right to equality before the law, guarantees the right to liberty and property, the right to free speech and worship. The way the document actually kind of defines those things or sets out these terms, there's a little bit of headroom that they build in. They say, okay, you have the right to free speech so long as you do not inhibit public order. So you can't go out and call for a revolution. You can't go out and call for murder or violence or things like that. But for the most part, you have the right to free speech. Like the United States, this is not a perfect document. One of the things it does is it creates a distinction of citizens. You have what are called active citizens, and those are, of course, men. You have to be over 25 years old. You have to pay taxes that are equal to about 3 days of work, and you can't be defined as a servant. So if you're an active citizen, then you can participate publicly in politics. If you're a passive citizen, if you're a woman, you do have some rights that are guaranteed. But just as in the American context, you're not going to be able to vote. It goes on. The Assembly also starts drafting a constitution for France. And not only are they drafting a constitution, this is 1789, they're saying, hey, you know, our good friends across the Atlantic were just involved in doing this. Let's write to Thomas Jefferson and see what he thinks. One of the kind of leaders of this revolution initially is the Marquis de Lafayette, which if you're familiar with American history, the Marquis de Lafayette is he becomes one of Washington's adjutants. He's a key link between the United States and France. He almost in many ways becomes the son that George Washington never had. They have a very, very close relationship. And so on September 3rd, 1791, they finally finished this Constitution. We now have a separate executive, legal, and judicial branch. One final thing that this initial kind of wave of French revolutionaries accomplish is that they also begin to displace the Catholic Church, or to break the power of the Catholic Church. Now today, many of us would say, well, wait a minute, that's kind of an attack on religion. You know, is it religious equality if you're confiscating church property, if you're closing down monasteries and things like that? The way that Enlightenment thinkers would have framed it, whether it's the right thing to do or not, the way that they would have explained it is they would have said, look, the Catholic Church has overwhelming authority. They have too much influence. They're full of superstition. And so this isn't really an attack on religion, but it is breaking the power of a religious institution. On July 12, 1790, they officially placed the clergy under the supervision of the state. And in November of that year, they say, look, if you want to be a Catholic priest, if you want to practice in France, you have to take an oath to the nation. Now think about that for a second. Catholic priests are part of the church. The head of the church is not the King of France. It is the Pope. In this context, many priests refuse to swear loyalty to the nation. They see it as conflicting with swearing their oaths to God and to the church. Okay, so far so good, right? We've sketched out the beginnings of an enlightened society. We're talking about the rule of law. We're talking about equality. We're creating greater liberty through the abolition of something like serfdom. They also abolished slavery in metropolitan France. They're not going to touch the colonies just yet, but they're going to start taking some steps. And so far, this sounds like that positive story. Dr. Hansen, how could any of this, turn out poorly? How could anybody oppose this stuff? But like any good horror story, the initial stages of the revolution begin to unlock these powerful forces that are going to radicalize the process and take us in a whole other direction. One of the big problems that's not just true in France, it's true universally, right? In a democratic society, philosophically, democracy is great. It makes a lot of sense, right? The people, the popular sovereignty, right? It's all coming from the masses. Everybody has their voice heard. But how do we decide what the will of the people actually is? Who gets to say, well, this is what the people think? Even if you get a majority of the people who say we want something a certain way, what rights do minorities have? Whether you're talking about religious minorities, ethnic minorities, minorities in senses of gender. Obviously today sexuality would be another thing that could be mentioned. What if we're just talking about minorities like, the number of Florida Marlin fans out there? Should everybody else who cares about baseball be able to force them to do something? How do we define the nature of the relationship between individuals and society in a way that protects the rights of individuals, but that also brings those wheels together? Because if we said, okay, everybody in the United States has to agree on everything, then nothing would get done. This is a problem that hasn't been thought out yet at that point. In today's society, in most democratic societies, We believe in what we call representative democracy. So you and I don't get to make decisions. We vote for people that then make decisions for us. And then if we don't like them, we can vote for someone else next time. Right? I don't say, they're gonna put in a new tax. I don't like that tax. I'm gonna get my pitchfork, march down to town hall, and I'm just gonna burn down town hall. Or maybe I'll take that politician that voted for it and I'll string him up and tar and feather him or her. And I'll show the will of the people. Most modern democracies practice what we call representative democracy today, but they didn't have that yet during the French Revolution. So they're going to try to set up some structures to figure out what is the will of the people, but as we'll see, it doesn't quite go according to plan. And this happens very early on. The first example that we can really say where people are practicing what we might call direct democracy, where the people, or the mob, if you want to be a little less supportive of it, where the people just make changes themselves. I mentioned at the beginning of our lecture, we had this issue of bread riots going on. And so in October 5th, 1789 to be specific, there's a group of women, they're in Paris, there's some riots, and they say, let's go to the king. Let's tell the king about how we're suffering. Let's see if he can do something to bring down bread prices. And so they actually march outside to Versailles, which, as we mentioned, is not necessarily close. It's a couple hours walk. And they start these demonstrations outside of Louis's palace of Versailles. Now, just nearby happens to be the National Assembly. And so they surround the National Assembly. They surround Louis's court. They actually kind of invade at one point the area that the National Assembly was in. And they say, you must do something. Now, there's a long tradition going back to the Middle Ages where monarchs face these kinds of protests from time to time. And so usually the king would meet with a delegation and say, okay, I'm here. I'm the father of the country. I will take X action to make things better. And Louis does this, right? He's not an idiot. Brings in the delegation. Oh, you guys are suffering. Okay. I will open up some of our grain reserves and I will help you. He also says, oh, by the way, we're kind of going through this revolution thing. I am totally going to accept without any changes this Declaration of the Rights of Man. I think it's actually not terrible. I will accept it. I will accept the dissolution of feudalism. I'm with you guys, wink, wink. But of course, as we know from our own era, rumors spread, misinformation spreads. And some of them, the next morning, discover an access into the Palace of Versailles at about 6 a.m. that was not guarded. And so they actually enter the Queen's apartments. They start looking for the Queen with ill intentions. Now, eventually they find all the people that invade. The Queen Marie Antoinette is okay. But the Marquis de Lafayette and the National Guard show up. And the Marquis de Lafayette says, look, King Louis, you should address the crowd. People are still angry. They don't trust you. You should go out and convince them that you're on their side. So Louis goes out and he gives this speech and the crowd starts chanting, Vive le roi, long live the king. Lafayette actually pins a tricolor on one of the king's bodyguards, right? Kind of saying, look, even the bodyguards are for this revolution. The king is for the revolution. Of course, he's not really for the revolution. A lot of people don't trust him to evolve from being an absolute monarch to, kind of the British model where the royalty is not too interested in actually doing a whole lot of day-to-day politics anymore, right? That doesn't seem very realistic that you just have this transformation. And so one of the things that the crowd does is it convinces, / demands, but kind of convinces, Louis and the National Assembly to move back to Paris. Louis will no longer be out in the countryside, surrounded by his palace and his guards and a comfortable distance from Paris. He will now be in the Tuileries Palace, which is right there on the Seine, very close to downtown Paris, right in the heart of all those people. And they can kind of keep an eye on him. Now, what we've witnessed is something that's a little bit different than the American Revolution, and in a very fundamentally way is very important. The legal head of state does not move because he wants to. He moves due to the mob. He moves due to the threat of violence. So the question becomes, if that's now how we're going to affect change, why not do that again? What's to stop us, right? If we need to protect the revolution, if we need to further the revolution, we're not going to debate it in committee. We're going to go out and make it happen. And so this then becomes the real danger of the French Revolution. Violence can cause social change. You can get rid of government officials. You can topple governments. You can change laws. You can execute your opponents. That matters, right? But once you go down that road, how do you stop it? How do you get the point when you say to the crowd, that's a bridge too far? Where are the brakes on this runaway train? This is the darkness at the heart of the French Revolution. It uses violence inspired by the mob to create change. But once it starts to do this, it can't figure out how to stop it until you get to Napoleon. The Women's March also reveals another fundamental flaw of the French Revolution, at least in its initial stages, which is that the guy who's at the top of the political pyramid, the guy who still has the most power in the entire country of France, is not someone who is loyal to the revolution itself. How can the head of the government not believe in the government itself? How do you put someone in office who doesn't believe in the laws that they are charged with enforcing? It's not lost on those crowds that welcome Louis to Paris in October 1789 that he is not a hero of the revolution. He is a prize that has been taken by it. He is a hostage, even if they haven't come out and said it quite so openly. Now, Louis XVI doesn't do himself any favors, so he's trying to still figure out, how do I get back into power? How do I suppress this revolution? His wife, who is Austrian, is clandestinely talking to her family about, okay, how do we get an army in here? How do we suppress this? Louis's youngest brother, Charles, well, he takes the title Charles X later on. I don't want to confuse you with a bunch of name changes. But the future Charles X goes abroad. And he starts saying, well, let's get an army together. King of Prussia, if you happen to field an army and crush this rebellion so that it didn't spread to your kingdom or to the Austrian kingdom, so much the better. In other words, we could describe this entire situation as a powder keg. The founding stones, if you will, the foundations of this constitutional monarchy that the French have created are cracked, are rotted, and it's only a matter of time before they fail. The moment that this lie sort of becomes exposed, that it's no longer possible to kind of think, okay, Louis, he's going along with us, he's one of us. The moment that exposes that is in the summer of 1791, June 20th to be exact. Louis tries to escape Paris. They try to smuggle the king and his family into a carriage and smuggle them past the troops and the guards that are supposedly on his side. The idea is to move him towards the northern frontier, where there's about 10,000 troops that are loyal personally to the king. And if he gets to the head of an army, well, this time they are going to fight it out with the kind of citizens' militias. And he thinks maybe we can win that battle and maybe we can reassert authority. They don't get very far. Basically, there was supposed to be a group of dragoons that were supposed to kind of be along the route, and they were going to escort Louis to this larger army, but they end up being withdrawn. Louis is not very shy. It soon becomes obvious to pretty much everybody. Think about, they live in a period without visual imagery. So the idea of trying to sneak across frontiers seems a little easier, right? How are you going to know who somebody is? You've never actually seen most people. Except, whose face is on all the coinage? Louis. So at the town of Rennes, about 30 miles north of Paris, they discover the royal family and arrest them. They bring Louis back, and they try to kind of make it work. They kind of say, okay, Louis, this is the conditions. You have to do X, Y, and Z. You have to pledge that you really, really love the revolution this time, that you're really, really going to go along with it. But most people are not fooled. Cries for a republic, for a state that has no monarch, begin to increase. On July 17th, 1791, about a month after Louis's been captured, members of Lafayette's National Guard actually opened fire on a crowd of pro-Republic demonstrators. And this is actually a seminal event in the history of the French Revolution. Because now we're not just talking about the king versus the revolutionaries, but the revolution itself becomes fractured. Men like Lafayette, who wanted a political revolution, but who want kind of brakes installed on how far we're going to go, they are now practicing violence, or seen as practicing violence, against the people who want a further extension of the revolution, a social revolution. At this point, anything associated with the king or the nobility becomes seen as a threat to the revolution. The Marquis de Lafayette, the guy who just a minute ago seemed like the great hero of the revolution, as maybe even possibly the French George Washington, now he's sided with the king. Now he's the enemy. And so what we start to see is a desire to purge those who were initially in favor of the revolution. The people who are calling for order become associated with the king, become associated with the old regime, the ancien régime, and now they are enemies of the revolution. For several months, they try to kind of make this work. There's this sort of tense situation. But a couple of factors further radicalize the story. One of the things that happens in 1792, in April, is that the National Assembly declares war on Austria. Now, part of the reason they do this is they figure the Austrians are eventually going to come for them. The Austrians are not in favor of republics and tearing apart monarchies, right? You're destroying the same kind of foundations of government as Austria has, as the empire. Well, you don't want to let that happen. Louis, interestingly enough, this is before his flight. Louis is kind of playing a double-sided game here. He says, if I say we should go to war, then it'll make it look like I'm really, still in love with France and the French state, and I'm on the side of this, revolutionaries, but maybe they'll get their asses kicked. Maybe they'll go up against a real professional army and lose, and then the Austrians will restore me to power. Because then I can come out and say, I was actually always against this. War radicalizes the situation, right? As the Austrian army is advancing into France and then eventually onto Paris itself, it makes people nervous, right? We don't have time for discussions. As Han Solo famously says in, I believe it's Empire Strikes Back, we don't have time to discuss this in committee. The Empire is here, they're invading the base, get on my ship, let's get out of Hoth. Adding to the problems, the Austrian allies in Prussia are also invading with an army in July, and the Duke of Brunswick, who is leading this army, issues a proclamation. And he says, if you touch one hair on the head, I'm paraphrasing here, if you touch one hair on the head of the royal couple, there will be, quote, unforgettable vengeance, unquote, to the people of Paris. Well, if you were on the fence about revolutionaries versus old order, again, they're coming with unforgettable violence. That's not good. And so it radicalizes the forces opposed to the king and the old order. Now, again, I'm simplifying this story because there's a lot of intrigues going on to it. But basically, on August 10th, 1792, radicalized militia units from the south of France, especially Marseille, storm the Tuileries Palace and kill hundreds of the king's guards. There is a real battle that takes place. Remember, the king was not isolated out in Versailles anymore. He's literally in downtown Paris. It's very easy to surround it, very easy to invade it. He actually winds up fleeing to where the delegates are from the assembly. But once it's clear that he's lost, they kind of decide, okay, we're not going to support you. We're not going to protect you. And they suspend his position and they arrest him. In December 1792, again, as France is in the middle of the first of a series of wars, Louis is tried for treason. One of the things that happens once they invade the Tuileries Palace is they get to find Louis' secret lockbox of correspondence. And the locksmith who built it says, you know what? I know this exists. I'll open it. You can read the correspondence. And people begin to see that Louis secretly is not so kind to the revolution. In December 1792, he is tried for treason. He is found guilty by members of the convention, which by this point had replace the National Assembly. They go through lots of name changes as you go through these moments in the French Revolution. And eventually, they vote to execute Louis. Now, it was a very narrow vote in the sense of they needed, I believe it was 2/3, to be able to convict him and execute him. And they just barely got above that level. It was not a close vote in the sense of it wasn't like, 152 to 148. I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but it was narrowly decided to execute him. Kind of adding insult to injury and thinking about, Louis XVI and how he was different from Louis XIV. Louis's own cousin, Philippe Égalité. That's not actually Philip's last name, but he adopts it, Égalité, Philip Equality. Right, Philip, I'm a noble, but my heart is with the revolutionaries. Philip votes to execute his own cousin. On Monday, January 21st, 1793, the 38-year-old monarch is beheaded. Now, again, I'm giving you kind of a short version of events. There's so much intrigue. There's so much story. And I mean, I just mentioned this Philippe Égalité guy. Philippe Égalité will eventually get the equality of the guillotine because that's how things work during the French Revolution. But I want to highlight, again, how is change taking place? How did the people decide that they didn't want constitutional monarchy? It wasn't necessarily through their elected bodies. It was only after they had invaded the Tuileries Palace, after the mob, after the militias had shown that they were not going to tolerate Louis anymore, that this process played out. And so again, we get to the problem that is certainly at the heart of the French Revolution. One could argue it's really at the heart of almost every revolution. Once you decide to take extra legal means to start a revolution, how do you stop it? How do you control the forces of the revolution? I mean, again, as you all know, I'm an American. I'm a historian. In some ways, it's a miracle what happened after the American Revolution, that they were actually able to get together and write first the Articles of Confederation and then later the Constitution without massive violence, that you were able to have a figure like George Washington, and I know I'm going off on a tangent about American history, but to have a figure like George Washington who had the charisma, who had the power of persuasion to unify the country, but then who could also let that go and not try to found a dynasty and not try to establish a dictatorship. I mean, it really is, speaking as a historian, it's kind of miraculous. So again, the question, once you start the revolution, how do you control its direction? Well, the short answer to this is that you come to embody the principles of the revolution. You start looking like the man or woman who is most fervently advancing its cause. You're the person who's saying, we need to do more. We need to go farther. And even if people don't agree that, the particular thing you've recommended is what should be done, they know that your heart is in the right place, right? They see you out there. The best way to embody the principles of a revolution is to become the man or woman who will fight for it. You give the great impassioned speech at a debating society like the Jacobin Club. You talk about the virtues and the values. And you don't get lost on the procedure and, this and that. And here's, we need, to adopt this plan. Here's my 6-point plan on, ending the French Revolution. You get up there and you talk about values. We believe in liberty, in equality, and in fraternity. And we're going to keep doing things to make those a reality. Eventually, you start to publish more and more radical things. The people that you disagree with no longer become people you disagree with. Right? Nobody wants to read, well, my good friend, the senator from so-and-so believes, we should have a lower tax rate or a higher tax rate. And I can understand his position. I just disagree with it. Here's my PowerPoint. Right? That doesn't get you likes on social media. That doesn't animate people. Being the loudest voice, accusing those that you disagree with of cowardice, of weakness, of lacking conviction, even of treason. This is how you mobilize people. This is how you inflame their passions. Populism, more than anything else, is about being someone who is a fighter, who embodies the values of whatever your cause happens to be. Turning things back to the French Revolution, this is what begins to happen, right? We are no longer going to sit around and debate the merits of laws. We are going to talk about things going on, events, individuals, loyalties, and more the conversation will drift from legitimate debates into demagoguery. To become the spirit, to embody the spirit of the French Revolution, you have to be the guy that's fighting its enemies. And the more this process happens, the more and more violence becomes justified. The more and more the nobles are not just people that, okay, they benefited from the old system, okay, we don't like most of them. The more and more they become enemies of the revolution, and the more you need popularity to advance in politics, the more and more you will turn to violence. And I've got just a couple examples here again. You know, this is the short version of the story of the French Revolution because there's so many examples of this. One of the things that happens in September 1792 is it looks like those Prussian and Austrian armies are going to march into France, right? They're not fighting necessarily the professional royal army of France. They are fighting a kind of hybrid of militia units, of volunteers, of some of the old army commanders are still there at this point. But it stirs fears and anxieties in Paris. The foreign troops are coming. This is going to be a really tough fight. Let's get at our enemies. We're not going to treat them with kid gloves. We're not going to pretend like they're not dangerous. And who are our enemies? Well, we've got nobles, but we've also got a whole bunch of Catholic priests. Priests who, a little bit before this, we said, look, you gotta show us your loyalty. You gotta swear allegiance to the nation of France. And a bunch of them do that. But some of them said, no, I'm sticking to my principles. My loyalty is to the church. My loyalty is to God. I don't swear allegiance to any nation. And quite a few of those guys are in prison because they refuse to swear allegiance. Crowds will surround those prisons in September 1792, and they begin massacring not just priests, but also common criminals that they just kind of say, open the gates, or we're going to beat these people to death. Right? This is not pleasant. This is not, death by firing squad. I'm sure that's not a pleasant thing to go through, but this is, we're going to not just kill people, but we're sending a message. If you sympathize with the old order, with the Catholic Church, we're going to beat this guy's brains out in the yard of the prison. So in the end, over 1,000 people are brutally killed in this manner. Now, luckily for the French revolutionaries, they end up winning that confrontation with the Prussians. There's a battle called Valmy, Valmy. They win this battle, surprisingly. The Prussians are kind of overstretched. Their hearts are not really in this fight. I want to say there was an outbreak of cholera or dysentery or something like that. And so the moment of crisis, at least in terms of external threats, seems to pass. Internally, however, the politics of the new republic that they're forming fall apart anyways. Right after the storming of the Tuileries, they say, okay, we just wrote this constitution, getting rid of the constitution. We don't have a monarchy anymore. Clearly the monarch was problematic. We're not going to put his son on the throne. And so they hold new elections. This time they're based on universal male suffrage. Right? We're not going for your kind of watered down enlightenment where, we only want men of property voting. We want universal male suffrage. We're not ready for women yet, but we have universal male suffrage. Well, eventually that creates factions. There's the group that wants to push the revolution ever farther, that has a more radical interpretation of what the revolution is and what it wants to do. Those guys are named the Montagnards, or the Mountain. You have the kind of moderate faction called the Girondins. Girondin is Girondins. French is a funny language. You don't pronounce a lot of the letters. So my apologies if spelling is an issue. You can always send me a tweet and I'll try to clarify spellings. But the Girondins find themselves recoiling in horror at the violence of the September massacres. They don't like the way that this is going. They don't like the idea of extra-legal uses of violence. So there's this publisher named Marat, M-A-R-A-T. I'm going to use the word Marat just because it's a little bit easier for, I think, English speakers to understand, but in French it's pronounced Marat. And Marat is really a rabble-rouser, right? He is the one who's just kind of saying the most fantastical things. He has a newspaper called L'Ami du Peuple, or the Friend of the People, right? So kind of embracing that populism. And so they kind of set a trap, and they're going to try Marat, and they're going to convict him, and they're going to try to put the brakes on kind of the more radical elements of the French Revolution. But Marat is not tried by a normal court. He's tried by a revolutionary court. And that court is sympathetic to his arguments and to his overall sort of program. So Marat gets acquitted. 1 month later, another left-wing journalist named Hébert, Hébert is spelled H-E-B-E-R-T, so like Herbert, but it's pronounced Hébert. He tries to lead another purging of the assembly, right? This was the more radical one elected by universal male suffrage. Hébert's attempt fails, but nevertheless, a large crowd gathers outside the building where this national convention is meeting, which again is kind of like the legislature. They're writing this new constitution, and they get together on June 2nd, and they gather outside, and they start calling for the arrest of Girondin members of the assembly who did not want to kill the king. For the members of the assembly who were more moderate and who weren't really to do everything for the revolution. Maybe they supported a large portion of the goals. Maybe they supported the virtues of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Maybe they supported some social revolution, abolishing feudalism, displacing the Catholic Church. But eventually, revolutionary politics meant you had to have an enemy. And so again, we have the mob. They surround this assembly, and they call for the expulsion and arrest of 29 of the Girondin deputies. Now, the Speaker of the Assembly at this point is a guy named Hérault de Seychelles, and he's kind of one of these figures that doesn't really understand what's going on. Right? He kind of understands it, but is not getting the full picture. So at one point, he says, okay, look, let's just go out to the crowd. We'll talk to the crowd. We'll reason with them. And we'll have this enlightened conversation, right? The Enlightenment was all about a conversation. We just need to talk to them. And so in kind of this comical way, the deputies go outside and they kind of try to escape. They kind of try to mingle with the crowd, to talk to it. And basically, Seychelles gets told, give us these 29 deputies or the cannons are going to fire. Going back to that question about power with Littlefinger and Cersei from Game of Thrones, power is not what the legislature is supposed to have. It's not the idea of sovereignty or the electoral results. Power is the mob. And if you don't do what the mob says, we're going to kill you. And so the deputies kind of go back in and they say, you know what, maybe we should expel these deputies. Maybe we should have them arrested. And at that moment, the more radical Montagnard faction basically seizes power. Right? It's not that they were elected that way, but they use the force of the mob again to create political and social change. Again, the story, and again, I'm giving you the shorter version of events. But the story doesn't end there. Marat, fresh off this triumph, goes back to his house. He actually had a skin condition that made it very difficult and uncomfortable for him to move around, and by this point it was getting worse and worse. And so one of the things that Marat had to do was actually to go soak in a bathtub. It was one of the only ways that it relieved the pain that he felt. So on July 13th, 1793, Marat is soaking in his bathtub. He actually has this kind of board put over the bathtub so he can use it as a desk. And this young woman named Charlotte Corday arrives at his house claiming to have some secret information about some of the Girondin deputies who had managed to get away during the mass arrest from the previous month. So Marat lets her into the bathroom as he's sitting there in the tub, And after about 15 minutes of talking to him, she suddenly pulls out this penknife and she stabs him in the heart. And he just kind of bleeds out within a number of minutes. Now, most of us would look at this tale and say, well, this is actually a caution against revolutionary violence. Marat thought that he had kind of everything figured out. He was at the pinnacle of his powers. And just like Caesar, he falls immediately murdered in his bathtub. But it's actually quite the opposite. Marat becomes stronger in death than in life. He is immortalized as a hero of the revolution, a defender of the common man, a martyr, a quasi-saint. Literally almost a quasi-saint. Later on, they'll invent this new religion of the supreme being. It's just kind of like a religion that's based around the idea of worshiping reason. And Marat becomes like a tribune or like, again, a quasi-saint of this movement. They will take the remains of Marat's body and they will put them in the Pantheon. And the Pantheon is a revolutionary era building where they kind of turned it into a church of the nation. So basically you take the most famous people from French history and from the French nation, people like Voltaire, and you put them in this temple. It's in downtown Paris, and there people can go to worship the nation and the revolution and all of its values. So again, Marat becomes more powerful in death probably than he actually had been in life. They actually take his heart and they take it out of his body and they go put it in an urn in a debating society where it's supposed to inspire better speeches. And again, this cycle of violence seems to perpetuate itself. Remember, we just talked about this invasion of the Tuileries Palace. We just talked about this purging of the Girondin deputies. Okay, now do we have settling of the revolution? Well, not quite. One of the first things that they did in the wake of that purging of the deputies was they said, okay, now we have a chance to create an entirely new constitution. And this constitution will reflect better the true energies of the revolution. So they write this constitution in just 8 days. And it's a really fascinating document if you look at it. It gives us a clear insight into the revolutionary mindset and the values that drove this acceleration of the French Revolution. Among other things, it lays out a right to work, a right to public education, a right to rebellion, which you can imagine was a little problematic. It, most importantly, even abolished slavery. They send over ships to what is today Haiti, and they say, guess what, French planners? We are abolishing slavery. But as a practical document, it's really basically irrelevant in the wake of Marat's death. Basically, even though they passed it, even though they created this document, the rule of law, these rights of man and of citizens, these rights are made secondary to the overall success and the necessity of preserving the revolution. Remember, we talked about how important it is to be seen as someone defending the revolution against all the enemies. And not just the awful, evil, aristocratic enemies, but especially the secret enemies, the moderates, the conservatives in your revolutionary group who are going to put a check on the achievements that can happen, who might sell you out at any moment. And so the incentive during the revolution is to further accelerate and to further move away from the rule of law. This movement away from the rule of law will eventually culminate in the construction of something called the Terror. The Terror is a dictatorship essentially run by this Committee of Public Safety that's set up in the spring of 1793. And this is so slightly before the death of Marat. But to preserve the revolution, again, as early as March of 1793, the convention had passed a series of laws that expanded the powers of the French state to use violence against its own population. For example, one of the things they do, they set up these new revolutionary tribunals in which justice will be dispensed slightly differently and slightly less traditionally without the checks and balances that one might normally expect. Another law from March 19th allowed the trial of armed insurgents without a jury. Part of the backstory that I've had to leave out of this discussion of the French Revolution is that as all these changes are taking place, various parts of France will rise against the revolutionaries who are based mainly in Paris. And so the French Revolution is also in some ways kind of a civil war. And so if you think about it, you're out there on the battlefield, you're fighting France's enemies, you're trying to preserve all of these amazing gains that you've tried to secure, these changes, these reforms. Why not empower your soldiers to deal out justice in obvious situations? Why bog them down with the legal niceties that potentially come at a cost, militarily or politically? Right? If you're going to say, hey, we've got to take a prisoner of war, we've got to take him back, we've got to try that person, there's a lot of effort and energy that needs to go into that. And if you're in an existential moment, you don't have time, one could argue, to do those things. And so why not allow revolutionary justice? The Committee for Public Safety will become the main vehicle for issuing arrest warrants and governing the country. Eventually, it's actually used to ban women from being politically active. They passed this thing later on in the fall of 1793 called the Law of Suspects. This law enables the state to arrest, quote, those who either by their conduct or their relations or by their words or writings have shown themselves to be partisans of tyranny or of federalism and enemies of freedom. How do we define an enemy of freedom from a legal perspective? How do we decide who is a partisan of tyranny? These are emotional categories. These are kind of values, but they're not legal categories. They're not sociological categories. People don't walk around going, I'm an enemy of freedom, arrest me. And so it becomes not just incredibly dangerous, but it inspires additional violence. The fifth part of that Law of Suspects reads those former nobles with their husbands, wives, fathers, mothers, sons or daughters, brothers or sisters, and agents of the émigrés who have not consistently demonstrated their commitment to the revolution. All of those people are now enemies of the state and can be arrested. It's not hard to see how this will spiral out of control. Hundreds of thousands of people are arrested. Farcical trials take place where they say, it doesn't really matter what you did or didn't do. The fact that you're a noble tells us all we need to know about you. You are condemned to either jail or in many cases death. In the end, over 10,000 people are killed in this terror. You're brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. You're accused of a crime. There's no presumption of innocence here. We're in a state of war. We're trying to achieve the revolution. I don't care if you are a noble who voted to execute the king, Philippe Égalité. You can pretend all you want to be a man of the people, but we all know where your true loyalties lie. These executions are also not just executions for the purpose of killing someone. They become rituals, right? You have the guillotine in the public square, and you bring the prisoners out, and you throw vegetables at them, and you hurl insults at them, and you bring your kids so that they can watch. You say to your son or your daughter, there is the enemy of the revolution. And look at the power of what the revolution is going to do to them. And they stick you up there and the guillotine falls. And off comes your head, and then the person picks it up and shows the crowd, look, here's the head with all the blood dripping out. This is the enemy of France, the enemy of liberty. 10,000 people die, and blood flows regularly on the streets of Paris. I mentioned before that, the French Revolution, for people living before World War I, for some, they, again, embrace these ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity, the values of the revolution. They don't focus as much maybe on some of the messier parts. But for others, this is the nightmare part. This is why you don't get rid of a king in England. It's good to have a king because the king is a central authority who can protect order. This is why you don't abandon the central role of religion in public life, because if you start abandoning those traditions, you can wind up with this unchecked violence. This is the heart of modern conservatism, right? And when I say modern, I mean kind of in a broad way, 200 years of it. But the whole idea of we don't want to abandon tradition, we don't want to experiment, socially speaking, Because if we go too far, you can really wind up in a lot of violence. Amazingly enough, I'm not at the end of the cycle of violence. But again, I've said this several times now. This is the short version. There's so many intrigues that keep going on, so many killings. By the summer of 1794, even that rump group of radicals, the Montagnards, have been split now into some who say, okay, we need to start dialing back a little bit, the whole suspending the Constitution, suspending, the right to life, which clearly is not being practiced. Maybe we should go back to that. Maybe we should kind of dial things down a little bit. You have another group that says, no, we need to accelerate it. It's not enough to confiscate the property of the Catholic Church. We need to begin dividing up the big estates. We need to take more forceful actions, especially against these guys in our own party who are sellouts. In the summer of 1794, the two wings of, again, just that Montagnard party are going back and forth at each other. And so the guy who is kind of the leader of the Committee of Public Safety, the man who most embodied the values of the revolution, or so it seemed, a guy named Maximilien Robespierre, who was a lawyer, who was a great public orator, who gave all these speeches at the Jacobin Club. He actually has the leaders of both his left and his right executed in the span of a couple weeks. Both of them are calling for each other's execution. He finally says, okay, let's take out one. And then when the other one thinks that they've won, he takes out them. And so he's kind of the last man standing. And then he himself is sent to the guillotine on July 28th because he's seen as a dictator. The point here is that the revolution eats its own. A lot of people have already suffered by this point. We've seen the nobles suffering. We've seen members of the Catholic Church suffering. We saw kind of more moderate members of the French revolutionary group suffer. There's a whole other side to this where peasants in the countryside, who are also in many places not very excited about this idea of radicalizing the revolution, especially in a province called the Vendée, they've all suffered. But in the end, these battles, these wars, this inability to put the brakes on the revolution, because we keep having increasing radicalization, increasing role of the mob, right? How do you mobilize the mob? Well, you need enemies. And when you run out of enemies, you create new enemies. In the end, it sweeps away all of the people that thought that they were leaders of that movement. How do you put an end to this? In the weeks after Robespierre is executed, they begin to form something called the Directory. The Directory faces several coup attempts, is itself involved in purges, and in the end, it's only the coming of Napoleon Bonaparte that will save the revolution or end the revolution, depending on your perspective. Only Napoleon can look like he is realizing the revolution and yet also bringing order. We'll get to that in a separate podcast about Napoleon because he's really a fascinating figure and he deserves our attention in very specific ways. What we can say, though, is that, again, the French revolutionaries, basically what they do is they destroyed the order of the monarchy and they didn't have anything to replace it with. I want to conclude basically by talking about something a little bit more lighthearted, a little bit more fun, and very important to where we're going with our course, right? We had talked about that gulf that existed between the people doing the ruling and the people that were being ruled. One of the things that the French revolutionaries in many ways invent, in many ways perfect, or at least introduce into the mainstream, is the idea of what we might call political culture. Right? They begin to break down that gulf that we saw, and they begin to say to ordinary people, you, stonemason, you, brewer, your voice, your opinion, your understanding and experience as part of the nation, that actually matters. Your voice matters. And of course, at differing points, it matters more and matters less. But again, they begin to say to ordinary people, you have a role to play in this story of governance, in this story of building a democracy. And so when I'm talking about political culture, I'm talking about the way that we take our political values, our perceptions about how politics should operate, our basic values, and we translate them into our daily lives. We have invented symbols that show our fellow citizens what we believe in, that show what we care about. And some of those are political, right? You wear your I like Ike button around so that everybody knows you like Ike. You're kind of from the Ike wing, if you will, of the Republican Party. Eisenhower, before he ran for office, was not known really as a heavy political figure. The Democrats tried to recruit him to run as a Democrat. Truman did. He was somewhat concerned about isolationist tendencies in the Republican Party in the early 50s. So to wear the I like Ike button didn't just mean, well, I'm going to vote for Eisenhower. It meant I, associate with the values that he stands for. And we do this in a whole lot of ways that's not just political. Think about the next time you're out driving or walking or running, and you see somebody wearing a Nike swoosh or an Under Armour symbol or Adidas or whatever company. It's not just a marketing gimmick. People wear Nike products that have the Nike swoosh on it because it is a statement about their values. Right now, I have on a Nike golf shirt, and it's also a Furman shirt. So I've got kind of double political culture, maybe some social culture is what you might call it, because Nike's not really political for the most part. I don't want to get into Kaepernick and all that stuff. But why am I wearing this? Well, I wear it because I'm proud of Furman. I work here. I support the university. I support its values and its mission. I'm an educator. I root for the sports teams. Matters to me. My students are on the teams. Why do I wear the Nike swoosh? I'm 40 some years old. I'm not an athlete. I'm not. Nobody. My son is 6 and he keeps saying, "Oh, Daddy, wouldn't you like to be a Major League Baseball player?" Yeah, I would. I'm a little bit past my prime for that. It's not going to work. I'm not an athlete in the real sense of the word, but I like to run. I like to play soccer. I like to pretend in some ways that I'm still good at that stuff. I enjoy it. I think of myself as a sports fan. I am a Furman fan. That is part of my identity. I'm a Cubs fan. I have a Cubs jersey. I have a Cubs hat. I have t-shirts. All that stuff is declaring my values and my allegiance. Some of you are in college right now. You've got your sorority t-shirt, your fraternity shirt. Right? You wear it to you wear it to class. You wear it around school. Why do you do that? Why do you make yourself into a walking billboard? Because you're telling other people that you care about those organizations, that you're a member of those organizations, that that's who you are. This idea of taking ordinary things like clothing and transforming them into symbols about your values, about what you believe in, that's what I'm talking about when I talk about political culture. And the French Revolution is one of the first political movements to start creating those symbols. They take, for example, the flag. And they say, we're not going to go with the old Bourbon flag, which is white. This isn't a country of the Bourbons anymore. This isn't territory owned by a king. Instead, we're going to make the tricolor. We're going to take the color blue and the color red from the city of Paris. We're going to stick the color white for the Bourbons in between it. And that will now be a symbol of the revolution. If I walk around with a tricolor, whether it's a button or a hat or something like that, I am saying to all my fellow citizens, I believe in the revolution. I support the idea of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And so they take this idea really to extraordinary lengths. They have this kind of red cockade hat that they make. And they say, okay, everybody's got to wear this hat to show that you support the revolution. They make playing cards. They reinvent the calendar. Okay, we're reinventing the calendar, not from 1789, but we're going to go back to the real beginnings of the really radical phase of the revolution. That's going to be year one. Think about that for just a second here, right? In Europe, in sort of the secular West, what do we date time to? We don't date it from when somebody first had the idea of counting. We don't date it to the beginning of the world. Even Christians that believe in the story of creation in a very literal sense, or creationism, they might say, well, the earth is 6,000 years old. But we date it from 2021. We're saying that the year that matters is 0. Why isn't that at the beginning? And of course, the answer is it's related to the legacy from the medieval period, or even the ancient period, of the role that Christianity played in European society. The fundamental event was the coming of Jesus. Even though now they date that a little bit later, right? When they were inventing the calendar, they thought that's the fundamental event that we want to go back to, is the birth of Jesus. The calendar expressed values. The calendar now has 12 months in it. It was originally 10, which is why most of the months trace their names back to Latin, right? Dece in Latin is the prefix for 10. And so December was originally the 10th month. And then they added 2 more months. July for Julius Caesar, and August for Augustus. His nephew Octavian, who became the emperor after Caesar was dictator. They put those names in there because they wanted to honor Caesar and Augustus. The revolutionaries do this with the calendar. They say, we're going to whole new calendar. We're going to start all over again. They start creating plays and festivals, rituals. One of the things they do is they start doing this thing called the Liberty Tree. The Liberty Tree is basically this, you plant a tree and it's covered with a tricolor, and you go up and you start singing songs to it, and you make pledges to it, oaths of loyalty. Maybe you might find some of those dirty, rotten nobles, and you stick them in front of it. You say, okay, noble, bow before the tree of liberty. Pledge allegiance to the tree of liberty. It became a way for everybody to say, hey, look, those are the values we support. We're all for liberty, equality, and fraternity. We support the revolution. Even if you didn't support it, you see, oh, here's all these other people that this is what they believe in. Maybe I should too, or even if I don't, maybe I should shut up. By the time you get to the most radical phase of the revolution in the 1793, 94, they actually create something called the cult of the supreme being. They're literally trying to worship philosophy as an abstract concept. They have this festival of reason that they carry out in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. It really gets kind of silly in some ways. But it is an effort to instill values, to create a political culture, to create a new set of loyalties where you're not loyal to the king because that's what tradition says, but you're loyal to the nation. You're loyal to the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity, even if the current government is not really honoring those necessarily at this time. What we're starting to see here, in addition to all the political turbulence, is we're starting to see the politicization of everyday life. Ordinary people begin to have a voice in politics. A voice not just in the sense of, well, every so often I get to vote, or I have the right to free speech, so therefore I can, go out and say whatever I want. But we're talking about the ability to declare your opinions and ideals and values about politics and to make those part of the public conversation. And that's quite a difference from the early modern period before the French Revolution. Okay, we're going to end it there. We will pick up in our next podcast by talking about Napoleon. And then after that, we'll have one talking about the Industrial Revolution. Basically, as we were starting this sort of modern age, the two great revolutions, the twin revolutions, some historians call them, are the French Revolution that changes politics in a way that you can't kind of go back to pre-1789. The other is the Industrial Revolution that's going to change economics. And of course, what we'll see is that economics is not just changing dollars and cents and money and production and things like that, but we'll bring it back to culture and eventually to identity. These two events are going to define the modern period. But we'll get into that in future podcasts. So that's our show for today. To find out more about future episodes, check out our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. Hope to see you then as we take history off the page.